Hi everyone, I'm Anna Rose. I'm the Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Wende, and I'm so happy to welcome you today for our Cold War Spaces series. We're welcoming Dr. Sasha Razor as our guest this week on the topic of protest space, identity, culture, and resistance in Belarus. She's a native of Belarus and an alumna of the UCLA Department of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. This June, she completed her dissertation titled We Were the River, Screenwriters of the Left Front of the Arts, 1923 to 1931. Her research interests focus on avant-garde cinema and literature, and Belarusian and Ukrainian literature and culture, and diaspora studies. Recipient of the 2020 ASEEES internship grant, she is currently working at the Museum of Russian Culture in San Francisco. Razor is a regular contributor to the Los Angeles Review of Books and has been working as a freelance journalist and commentator since August, appearing on Current Time TV, BBC News, Mundo, CGTN America, and KPFA Berkeley. Razor is also working on the project of creating the Belarusian Protest Music Archive. So today's program will be about a 30-minute conversation between Sasha and Joes Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. After that, we'll leave about 15 minutes for a Q&A, so please get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time. And as always, we appreciate everyone's questions, but please keep them short and no longer than a sentence or two. And as we're getting started, feel free to say hi in the chat and say what city you're tuning in from. And just a reminder to change that blue button to panelists and attendees so everyone can see your messages. We'll be posting the recording of today's talk on our Vimeo page, where you can find all the recordings of our past virtual programming. And lastly, I'd also like to thank Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And now I'll hand it off to you to get started.
Thank you very much, Anna Rose. In 6 days from now, the United States will have what is already one of the most heavily contested elections in American history. Republicans are claiming massive democratic election fraud through mail-in voting, and Democrats decry Republican voter suppression and voter intimidation. Only 3 months ago, Belarus experienced an equally, if not more contested election that kept President Alexander Lukashenko in power, but resulted in ongoing mass protests and demonstrations. Last Sunday, more than 100,000 people demonstrated in Minsk, the capital city of Belarus. Today, we are going to discuss these protests, some of their Cold War origins, and the remarkable role of art and culture in the resistance movement against Lukashenko with Sasha Razor, who, as mentioned, is both a historian, cultural historian, and a journalist following and interpreting the current protests. So Sasha, welcome to Cold War Spaces.
Hi, Joes. Thank you for having me here today.
It's a great pleasure. So let me start with a very obvious question. What is your personal relationship to Belarus?
Yes, so I am originally from Belarus, from the town of Mogilov, which is a large regional center in East Belarus. I was about 14 years old when Alexander Lukashenko came to power, and at the age of 17, I've already decided to immigrate. An interesting fact about me is that I studied for 1 year in the history program from which Alexander Lukashenko graduated. And I just came from this background where I studied and I saw the place which kept producing communist functionaries and then Lukashenko's cronies in the post-Soviet space, and I decided to leave. So I'm speaking today to you as a diaspora member, as a member of the Belarusian transnational academic community, just one of many, because there are many of us scattered all over the world. And also I'm addressing to you as a Belarusian who has been waiting for 26 years now for things to start finally changing.
Right. And things seem to be changing rapidly right now. Can you tell us a little bit about your background image? What are we seeing?
Yes, so I am located in California right now, and after searching for an image, I decided to use the image of the KGB building in Minsk because it is the central root of our problems, I would say. And an interesting fact is that you can be arrested in Belarus for taking a picture in front of the KGB building. So it's a very significant thing. Also, there is a small jail in its court called Americanka, which keeps the high-profile prisoners, and where many prisoners are right now.
Right, thank you. So Belarus under President Lukashenko is often described as the last dictatorship in Europe. But yeah, as mentioned, he's under severe pressure, and the current protests were sparked by the August 9 election results. Officially, Lukashenko won around 80% of the votes, and the opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya received less than 10%. But that, of course, is heavily contested. How would you say, do we know these numbers are false or remotely accurate? How does that work?
Okay, so as I'm answering, I'm going to share my screen.
All right.
To just use it as an opportunity to promote and advertise some Belarusian art. Okay, it's working now. So yes, indeed, there is such cliche that about the last dictatorship of Europe that became almost a brand of a country, and now contemporary art scene uses it really well to its advantage. But in fact, neither part of this phrase are true, because it used to be technically not a dictatorship, but authoritarian regime, and not the last one in the region. I mean, look at Russia, for example. Also, Belarus is not politically in Europe, although Belarusians themselves do persist that they are in the center of Europe and use it as a self-description often. So the election results, I would like to share with you the results of the most recent study by Rehorostopeni from Chatham House. And he used a computer-assisted web interview method, which is quite reliable. And according to his latest data, only about 20% supported Alexander Lukashenko, while Svetlana Tikhanovskaya has won by 52.2%. And I think that there could be more questions about this data, but this is the best study that we have so far, which was released last week. Also, Ostapenia surveyed the attitudes of the Belarusians, and he distinguished three chief groups in this protest. 43% support the protest, about 33% are spectators or bystanders, kind of waiting it out, and 23% of Belarusian population are the Lukashenko stronghold and keep supporting him. And unfortunately, this survey was not conducted in the villages, just the cities, but I imagine that the situation might be similar in the villages as well.
All right. So can you tell us who are typically involved in the protests, what layers of society, and also who are not involved? And why do these demonstrations pop up now so massively at this point?
So this is indeed unprecedented, because all stratas of Belarusian society participate in the protest, from students to women, mothers, to senior citizens and people with disabilities. We used to joke that they didn't come after the children yet, but children, they chant the protest slogans as well. But you know, just last week, the government tried to pull the license of the children's hospice in Grodno. So children are affected, and affected severely as well. And it is a type of protest where the industrial workers innately agree with people like opera singers or conductors or culture workers. It really stretches across all layers of the society. It is more difficult to say how it works out in provincial towns and not Minsk, because the coverage is not steady and we just don't get much news from the regions. But I can tell you that the regions were very active in the pre-election cycle, and I watched every single rally of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and I was astonished what a huge crowd she gathered in those towns. And also we've seen a lot of resistance to the police in the small towns, which was quite remarkable, because, you know, in Belarusian small town, it's a cosmos in itself and people know each other. So attacking a policeman might have repercussions. It's somebody's friend, somebody's brother, mother, etc., etc. So it's very, very difficult. Women, we have to say, is a large part of this protest, and it is interesting how this came about. Some
Yeah,
people are
because
very,
also, sorry to interrupt, but I always understood that Belarus was a pretty patriarchal society. So I was, and many people actually are struck by the agency of women during these days. Yeah.
while it is true that Belarus was and stays a patriarchal society with sexism implemented at the state level, it is also true that Belarusian women have been outstanding and very strong and very beautiful for a long time. It just came to the public view now. So there could be several factors that explain the strong participation of women. One of such is that it is a reaction to the patriarchy. It is a reaction to arresting the man. And this happens in many feminist movements across the world. It happened during the Polish Solidarity as well. Another explanation that we now have a new generation on the streets, and this generation does not share or hold the older patriarchal values. So there is a lot to talk about, but it is also important for me to credit the work of many Belarusian feminists who worked for years before, and their ideas were not in the mainstream, but still by studying feminism and writing theoretical articles, many people and institutions contributed to what became the movement today.
Right. So if you look at photos from the demonstration, for instance, the one on the bottom right side, you see a lot of white, red, white flags. Can you tell us a little bit about the symbols and this particular flag and what it means?
Yes, it's a great question. And behind its simple facade, there is a lot to discuss and talk about, because innately, we operate in a cultural dysglossy of sort where we use the two sets of symbols. And this was the situation since 1995. The first set of symbol comes from the Belarusian People's Republic, so BNR, and this is the white, red, and white flag and the coat of arms. And its origin is, it connects to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania insignia and that of the Polish and Lithuanian Commonwealth. The second set of symbols is Soviet. And for a long time, after Lukashenko banned so after the collapse of the Soviet Union, many former Soviet republics took some new symbols. All of them did, in fact. And Belarus was the only country that went back to the old Soviet symbolism. But I have to tell you that being a member of the Belarusian opposition, and we have been operating with this double set of symbols for a very long time. And even in Ukraine, the situation is quite similar, and they describe phenomenon in their scholarship in terms of two Ukraines. There is a famous essay by Mykola Rybchuk. So Belarus has something very similar, and I think it was poet Marey Martysevich who wrote the first essay about the two souls of the Belarusian culture, and the situation with the symbols was quite similar. Now, during this summer, during Svetlana Tikhanovskaya campaign, we have seen two flags in her rallies, two flags side by side in the demonstrations. But after the elections, the old Soviet symbols are gone and the white, red, and white flag has returned triumphantly. As to what it means, I think it means different things to different people. And I certainly tend to agree with the sociologist Yelena Agapova that for younger generation, this flag means something else. This means the opposition to the Lukashenko regime. And perhaps not the pride in the old nationalistic Polish and Lithuanian roots. So we have to be very careful when we interpret them.
Right, interesting, yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about the tactics of the protesters and maybe if they were inspired by other demonstrations worldwide? How does that work?
Yes, this is extremely interesting, and I'm just showing you the picture of the invention of the Belarusian protest, the so-called human chains or SEPKA, because this is the first time that we see this happening in the global protests. So indeed, there are many tactics that I've seen, and just trying to figure out what is happening, I grouped them in three major groups. The first group of protest techniques or tactics comes from the decentralized peaceful protest modeled after Hong Kong and Khabarovsk. It is a decentralized protest in its structure. So we have seen a lot of human chains, strikes, resignations, marches, sit-ins, die-ins, blocking the road, also teaching public lectures in the Minsk neighborhoods. Another thing is chanting, which is very interesting because right now people march in smaller groups. And when you walk in smaller group, you have a greater potential to improvise. So the whole Minsk looks to me right now, it's a Greek chorus with smaller groups moving around town and chanting. And being a Slavicist, I cannot help but start, collecting these chants and figuring out the rhythmical patterns, which are very interesting. And so the second group of protest techniques, it is a violent group. And I know that the core of the protest is peaceful, yet it is also a reported fact that there were Molotov cocktails right after the protests. There were some barricades, arsons, and we have seen true self-immolation. So this is also something to think about, because while we would love to present ourselves to the world as peaceful, these things happen, and actually a series of arsons goes uninvestigated in Belarus. I keep reading about them, and I do not know who does it and what this is. Also, the third group of the protest techniques is uniquely Belarusian and just happened now. This is the cyber attacks. There is a group of the cyber partisans, so cyber guerrilla fighters, as they call them, and they have been hacking the state websites. And they have made a claim that they're going to attack the bank system. Again, this group is much glorified and people admire them and believe in the tech potential of the country. But knowing a little bit about it, I can tell you that it is much easier to hack a WordPress-powered site than to hack the bank system. And the largest discussion which is due right now is about the de-anonymization techniques and facial recognition software, because both the police uses it, but also the protesters. And they have managed to identify all members of the riot police who committed crimes. So this is something to look forward to. So summarizing my answer, structurally, it is a decentralized protest like in Hong Kong, like in Khabarovsk, and it borrows some themes from other protests. For example, slogans from the Black Lives Matter movement, or a song from the Ukrainian Maidan, but we can talk about thematic borrowings, not structural. At the same time, there are also great parallels to the Polish solidarity movement. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Tatiana Kulakiewicz, talks a lot about it specifically. Another scholar to listen to about comparison between Belarusian and Ukrainian situation is Andres Umlaut. And there are many recordings already online for people to tune in and listen to what he has to say.
Right. So let's talk a bit about the remarkable role of art, music, and literature in the protests. I don't know of another example of demonstrations where culture and the arts were so prominent. How do you explain that? And can you give maybe some examples how artists are involved in these protests?
Oh, this is just few examples of how the regular citizens protest. For example, on your left, you see a costume of the artwork by a Dutch artist known in the Slavic world as Ždun, and then the projections on the apartment blocks. So people do that a lot. But if we are to talk about the art, I have to say that Belarusian art has always been very interesting and vibrant. And perhaps what you see in the protests is a reflection of the Belarusian culture as such, of the unofficial Belarusian culture. But in the moments of social transition, of course, we experience the cultural effervescence of sorts. And this is when it all comes to the surface. For a long time now, Belarusian contemporary art was very much influenced and operated under two paradigms. The first one you see on your screen right now is Nothing Exists. This is a cover of a book by philosopher Valentina Kudovich called The Code of Absence, which explains the peculiarities of Belarusian national identity as the one which exists under the predicament of being dominated by major cultures. So innately, it is impossible to articulate a very traditional ethnic identity in this condition. And the artwork that you see comes from 2009 by Alexei Lunyov. It says "Nothing exists, ничего нема." And this was the Belarusian response to the absence of the country's non-participation in the Venetian Biennale. Fast forward 10 years from that moment, and we do have, and we always did a lot of work. This is the performance art by Belarusian artist Alexei Kuzmich, and it is, the title is "I Believe," and it comes in two parts. He stood at the election poll and later under the attack. So this is Alexei Kuzmich. There's another great artist, Uliana Slesar, and I just didn't find her work right before, but she did a beautiful performance recently and she was detained. This is a brand new work by installation by Sergei Shabokhin called Social Marble, which was just installed in Poland a few days ago. And it imitates the practice that you see on the picture here by, so the photograph by Olesya Pcholka, how the people started co-opting the old Soviet monuments and putting the posters, the protest posters on them. And what's remarkable is that he installed this maybe 2 days ago, and the Polish protesters, because there are huge protests happening in Poland right now, also their signs there because of the abortion ban in Poland.
Right.
Another work which I want to show you is embroideries by remarkable Rufina Bazlova. And she just came to the fore now, but she worked for quite a long time. And she does this politically themed embroideries, embroidering in real time what she sees in the news and the heroes of the revolution. And the work on your right is by wonderful Minsk-based artist Antonina Slobodchikova, who created a logo for Svetlana Tikhanovskaya campaign used by millions of people. And this is her commentary on how women oppress other women, how the protester women have to also collide with the women in the riot police, because there is quite a lot of that. And Antonina has been doing wonderful political art, totally worth seeing. I just could not include all of it in this lecture. This is two very interesting work. On your right is the work of a Belarusian famous conceptualist of the older generation, Vladimir Sessler. And so you see he created a kind of a sign for the public housing, for the outdoors, saying that in this house on such and such day, Svetlana Alexievich was interrogated because she was summoned for interrogation. And then you also see the old Belarusian coat of arms with a chronology, or the reverse chronology of the Belarusian Republic of the country, because 1937 is a very important date in the country's history. This is when the massacre, it's a year of the Stalin's purges, when the massacre of the intelligentsia happened. And on your left, this is not a professional artist, but a theater person, Nikolai Khalezin, the founder of the Three Theater Company, which is very famous. And he wrote a palindrome, which became viral online. It says, "Sanya, go away, there are many of us." It was shared by many, many people and really talks to this. And just the two photographers. We have Lesya Pcholka, who I think her photograph is wonderful, and it encapsulates all the Belarusian textures and even the lettering that we work with. The sign says, Amon's president, the president of the riot police. And on your right is again a non-professional photo by poet Maria Martysevich, who took a snapshot of the police transportation vehicles behind the KGB building at the background of the Soviet urn. And I thought it was wonderful and I wanted to share it. So this is pretty much my coverage of the contemporary art today.
Fantastic, yeah. So maybe before we move to the Q&A in a few minutes, I want to ask you about another activity of yours. You are not only writing about Belarus, but you are also collecting protest songs. And I'm very curious to hear a little bit what these songs have in common and what makes them stand out if you compare them to international protest songs.
All right, so this is my favorite question, and I can tell you right now that Belarusian protest repertoire consists of maybe 2 or 3 international songs, 1 Russian song, and the rest are Belarusian. The most famous international song is Mury, which was translated from Louis Llach's song Listaka by Jacek Kaczmarski and became the most famous song of the Polish solidarity. It was also prominent in the Arab Spring and was translated to Russian by poet Andrei Khadanovich. And it was used by Sergei Tikhanovsky in his pre-election campaign, and now is sung across Belarus and enjoyed by many people. The Russian song is Viktor Tsой's Перемен, and the rest are Belarusian songs which can be grouped in 3 groups. This is first of all the folk songs, also the songs to the poems by Belarusian poets, and some older anthems, spiritual anthems. Also, there is a rock and roll songs from the late 1990s that somehow caught up with the students. There was this wonderful song called The Three Turtles that everyone is singing, and it's really hard to figure out why this song became popular, not the other one.
Right, yeah, and it so happens that 3 weeks ago we had Joanna Stingray as guest. You recently interviewed her for the Los Angeles Review of Books, and she also talked about Viktor Tsoi, and it's very fitting that one of his songs became so important in the protests in Belarus. Can you maybe finally, before we go to the Q&A, tell us why you think this song stood out or became so central?
Yes, of course. And this was my question as well. And I can tell you that Joanna, I think she nailed it. And the way she explained it to me is that, first of all, Tsoi did not write political songs, political lyrics, yet he never also commented truly on the meaning of this particular song, The Changes. But that was the signature song by the Kino Band, the strongest song, the song that he opened his concerts with. And when Sergei Solovyov took this song for the finale of the Asa, the film, he remediated the song and placed it in the political context. I never spoke to him. I don't know why and how he did it and what was the decision-making process. This is something to learn. Later, after Gorbachev, and this is when Viktor Tsoi became really huge. This film made him a star. This is what opened up Kino to millions of people, as opposed to before when he was just very well prominent in the underground rock environment. Later, when Gorbachev commented on this song and said, we want changes, this is when it really, became a part of the Cold War history, or the end of the Cold War history. Right, in Belarus, we have seen a different usage of this song, and I'm showing you the story of the 2 DJs who turned this song on during the pro-government rally and kind of, co-opted it, and their figures later became the mural, and they called one of the Minsk neighborhoods the Square of Changes. And this is the mural which was painted over for more than 10 times now. People just struggle and keep repainting them. And this is a site of concerts in Minsk. There is about 5 neighborhoods in Minsk right now that hold this overnight protest concerts and tea drinking. And there are just huge parties going on. So in Belarus, people played I Want Changes for maybe the past 10 years and nothing happened. But once you create some kind of symbolic action, this is when things really happen. And so it's the usage of music.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And on that note, let's go to the Q&A. We already have a few questions. First one is by Molly Jane Zuckerman. At the beginning of the protests, a friend of mine who lives in Minsk said that she was afraid to walk around the city for innocent errands if she was wearing white, I think, because just wearing that color was enough to get her arrested. Has that strong sense of color association with protest continued?
So white is a traditional color of the women's suffrage, and it was chosen by Svetlana Tikhanovskaya pre-election campaign. And protesters used to wear white ribbons, which was associated with 2011 Moscow political rallies, like this white ribbon that came from Moscow. And after people started getting arrested in droves, they figured out very quickly that they somehow need to diffuse their identities and start hiding a little bit. So right now the symbolism still persists, and you can see many women coming out in the protest colors, the red and white, but I also know that people are more concerned about their safety, survival, and prepared to go to jail when they go out, and maybe wearing something comfortable, no high heels and a backpack is the best thing the protester can do.
Right, I can imagine. Okay, thank you. Next question is by Bruce Hollihan. What kind of a future do you think is possible for Belarus? Like you have said, there is a strong connection to the former Soviet Union and Russia. If Belarus follows the path of Ukraine, is it possible that Russian interference would be more severe in Belarus when compared to the Ukraine?
So the question of Russian interference in Belarus is quite complex, and from what I gather right now, it is not so comfortable for Russia to do so. It is expensive. We just maybe in the unknowns of it. But,
sorry, what do you mean by expensive?
Well, Belarus has been a dotation state for Russia for a long time and relied on its subsidies and cheap oil and gas. And right now, when the country's infrastructure is being actively destroyed, it would be Vladimir Putin's nightmare to have to subsidize and feed this entire region. So it is economically not viable at all for Russia. And this is the solace that we have. So for now, it does not look like Russia might invade or is going to invade, yet of course Belarus remains in the area of its geopolitical interest, and they have not been friendly or helpful so far. They put Svetlana Tikhanovskaya on the criminal list. And we are currently with the informational war with Russia because their news coverage is very, very not empathetic to the Belarusian protesters.
Yeah, is that why Lukashenko feels he can just stick to power because he will be rescued by Putin if necessary?
Not quite so. Lukashenko has been manipulating both the West and Putin for a long time, and judging by the amount of loan which he received from Russia, he is no longer supported, but it is a very tough situation for Russia and they do not know how to react yet. The best case scenario, however, would be to transition to a peaceful democracy and to use the help of the international community to get the country back on its feet and to rebuild its infrastructure. It is a long road, it is a very difficult road, but quite doable.
Right, thank you. The next question is by Marty Zisner. Can you compare or contrast Polish and Ukrainian protest movements against Belarus?
Well,
yeah, maybe you already talked a little bit about it. Yeah.
I did mention it. I think that Belarusians studied the Ukrainian protest and the Belarusian regime also studied the Ukrainian protest. And there is no chance that we could repeat the same thing that Ukraine did because the forces were uneven, the government had a lot of ammunition, rubber bullets from Poland, stun grenades from Czech Republic, sold to the dictator. And there was no way that people could go out, start burning tires and building barricades. It's a different protest conditions. There are huge structural similarities to the Polish solidarity, but also many people already commented on it, saying that it is much worse in Belarus right now than it was in Poland. And the type of resistance from the government is unprecedented. Because in Poland, it took years and years for them to change things, and they struck and they did things. And it is similar. I can also tell you that when the solidarity was happening in Poland, it never resonated much with the Belarusians in Belarus, and they just did not support them for some reason. But right now, there are always historic connections and parallels that come to the fore.
Okay, thank you. Jesse Odell asked, could you comment on your experience with the educational system in Belarus?
Yeah, sure. So I was a regular kid from a small provincial town. My parents were not very rich. So the first place I could go to is the Mogilev State Pedagogical University. And I absolutely loved my year there because I worked in archaeology lab and I was doing ethnography studies. I wanted to be a historian. What happened is that we went through the political murder that shook my department. The father of my classmate, Alessia Mikalutskaya, who was one of Lukashenko's associates, died as a result of a bomb explosion. And when Alessia didn't come to school, I felt awful, and it affected me so much. And I went to the nearest Soros Center, which existed in Belarus back then, and started filling out applications to foreign scholarships. But I think that the space itself, it had many talented people, and archaeology was not a politicized topic back then. And that's whom I wanted to be.
I see. Thank you. Yeah. Claire Hafner writes, I have heard of a lot of instances of people being tortured or treated inhumanely while they were detained. Has there been any accountability for that yet? And if not,
No.
do you think there will be?
So as of today, there was not one criminal case opened on the account of the human torture in jails. Yet I think there will be some accountability because Vesna Human Rights Organization has been documenting them. It was an ordeal. It was very difficult to document because victims are not always willing to talk, but there were 450 cases reported to the UN. Also, there's about maybe like 600 of cases that we are talking right now. And in the best case scenario, Belarus might go through something like a Nuremberg trial. This would be my hope. But
right.
again, I'm not a policymaker, and the policymakers also hope that this will be investigated, but it's a long road to that.
Right, thank you. Yeah. Olga Klimova writes, unlike, let's say, 10 to 15 years ago, social media and modern technology have allowed Belarusian artists and musicians to create and share their artwork. Most of them used Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, etc. to post their work for the consumption by the general public. It does help to make the protest movement in Belarus more visible and to draw the world's attention to the political situation in the country. Do you think that it may play a crucial role in the outcomes of the 2020 Belarusian protests and the involvement of other countries, or do you think it's an insignificant factor?
Well, hi, Olga. I know Olga, she's wonderful. So while I agree with the statement and fully agree with it, that it became visible because there were so many people posting on social media, donating their time, labor, and talent to the protests. I also think that a very solid policy making is due, and we can attract attention to the problem as much as possible. And I think the whole world is watching us already, and we are heard, our voices are heard by now. But the success of the next step depends on the ability of the Belarusians to consolidate and produce a very good self-governance process for this transition.
Okay, thank you. I have two questions that I think I can combine. The first is by Ali Ikman, who writes, thanks, Sasha. Can you talk about the ethnic complexity of the situation? Is there an ethnic component in taking sides among the protesters or the supporters of the government? And I would like to couple that with Marty Tisner's question. How are minority groups, for instance, Roma and Jews, regarded during the protests?
Hi, Ali. Hi, Marty. This is a great question. So it is, in fact, a subject of a huge scholarly debate. What do we call this revolution? National, post-national, or neither? And while some people would like to say that, well, this is a purely post-national revolution, an ethnic component does not exist, it does not matter. And we remember Valentina Kudovich, the Code of Absence. very difficult to articulate the national identity in Belarus. At the same time, when I look at the protest videos, I wonder, where do ethnic instruments come from? They're playing the pipes, they're playing the hurdy-gurdy, they're doing these round dances, which are the staple of the ethnic dance, which me, as growing up and being educated as a Belarusian nationalist during the historical revival, I never even saw that. And this is when groups of people are performing these round dances for the first time and thus entering history as its subjects. At the same time, I probably tend to agree with someone like Tatiana Shitsova from the European Humanities University, who says, you know, it's early to talk about right now. This revolution is neither national nor post-national. It's something else. We are still figuring it out. There are new constellations. And I have to say to Marty that yes, the questions of ethnic minorities has also been a part of it, and there was a great consolidation and solidarity between different ethnic groups in Belarus who are protesting. At the same time, I have seen several cases of the surge of anti-Semitism among the government officials in Belarus. So this is something that needs to be watched and reported more. And still the Belarusian society as such, despite being multi-ethnic and having a reputation for tolerance, has some problems and would need to learn how to live with the other and with the neighbors. It's not a huge factor right now, but when I browse social media, I see little things here and there.
Right, thank you. David Edick asks, are there any prospects for Victor Babarico to return to political relevance? So my first question would be, who is he? And then maybe you can answer his question.
So before the elections, Viktor Babarico was the chief Lukashenko's opponent who enjoyed a genuine popular support. Among the Belarusian opposition, there were many fears articulated about his connection to Moscow and his connection to Gazprom. And despite of him being very interesting, charismatic, a patron of the arts, he was the person who returned a large collection of modernist Belarusian painters to Belarus. I see the word Gazprom and I am speechless, and I have problems with that as well myself. So I don't want to indulge in the conspiracy theories, and we will have to see when he comes out. I think that he has good chances, and he is genuinely supported and loved by many Belarusians.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Next question is by Linda Pollack. Who are the players outside of Belarus supporting the movement, NGOs, European Union, if they exist? Back in '89, Soros Network played a role, but what about now?
Okay, so you are talking to one person who received the George Soros grant at the age of 18 and left Belarus. And right now, I would say that the largest force behind the Belarusian protest outside of Belarus is the headquarters of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, located in Vilnius. And they conduct, and she works with many professional politicians who conduct negotiations with major European establishments and institutions, reaching out, asking to increase the sanctions and asking for the plan for the future. Also within Belarus, we have a structure called the Coordination Council, which was formed on a democratic basis and includes 5,500 people. And anyone could apply to become a part of this structure, and many people did. And so we do have internal group and also external group, and perhaps even several. But I think it is in a good shape, and they're doing the good work already.
Okay, thank you. We have one final question, which is great because we're at 1:45 by Volga Izakava. Thank you for a great talk. My question is about colonial legacy, and how do you think post-colonial conditions inform the revolution today?
Well, this is again a very important and also very complex question to address in a short answer. I probably tend to agree with Princeton anthropologist Sergei Ushakin, who describes Belarusian identity as retro-colonial, meaning that the country went through the colonial experience without realizing it, and it's kind of a post-factum realization of who you are in this space and in this constellation. I know that Belarus, or that there is a journal that is preparing the whole issue of the post-colonial analysis of the Belarusian events, Urban Period Journal, which is very interesting. And I think we will see many different responses from the scholars to emerge.
Okay, wonderful. So Sasha, I want to thank you so much for a really wonderful presentation. And it's very informative as well.
Thank you.
And then next week, we will pause the Cold War Spaces series because it's the day after the American elections. And I'm sure everyone wants to focus on what is happening then. But we are back the next week, November 11th, with a panel discussion with Ellen Du Bois, Emeritus Professor of History and Gender Studies, and Brenda Stevenson, Professor of History and African American Studies, both at UCLA, about the election, putting it in historical perspective and discussing what comes next. So I wish you very well 2 weeks. I hope you're all voting or have already done so. And please come back in 2 weeks to discuss what happens on November 3rd and afterwards. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.